Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from M for Climate Action Forum, and this is one of the many webinars we do on a whole series of different topics. And today we're going to talk to Ben Cuddon. Now, Ben is really interesting because he's developed an organization called Climate Ed, and they're all about climate change, but they're all about getting climate change talked about in schools, and they provide help through volunteers in doing that. And that's an interesting project. And we're going to talk to him about that today and how he's developed that and what it is. So, Ben, thank you for joining us today. And maybe you could start by just telling us very briefly a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I was working as a history teacher, and teaching history in South London schools. And I had a side interest in climate change because I'd been running workshops for adults in my local community as part of a scheme called Carbon Conversations, where groups of people can come together to explore how they can reduce their carbon footprint. And I suppose I just saw there was an opportunity to bring these two things together, carbon conversation style work addressing carbon literacy, but in a school environment. And that was the initial impetus behind setting up Climate Ed.
I mean, I gather your background when you studied was medieval history, and now you move from medieval history to the future and climate change. I mean, but when you started this project and you decided it was a good thing to do, was it partly because you thought climate change was not adequately taught in schools?
I suppose that was part of it, although when I was teaching in schools, I was just teaching history, so had a very narrow remit. I wasn't able at that time to sort of comment on the state of climate teaching across schools. I just didn't know. But on a very personal, limited level, I realized that the students I was teaching and in my secondary schools, knew very little about climate change, not through any fault of their own, just they hadn't had the opportunity to learn about it, and just as importantly, they haven't really had the opportunity to engage with it in a wider sense about about what they could do about it.
You talked about pupils not knowing, but to some extent that's true of teachers as well, isn't it? I saw a survey, it may have even been on your site, saying that 75% of teachers felt that they hadn't received adequate training in climate change. And is that something that motivated you as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I saw that stat until after we'd set up Climate Ed, but I suppose that sort of helped to underline, the purpose and of what we were doing. Yes, I mean, that stat is true. I don't think that's the sort of fault of any teachers. I think, it's simply because climate change is such a big, complicated issue to teach. I think a lot of teachers just think, well, maybe I know about this, but how should I teach it? Where should I place the emphasis? Because you can approach it in so many different ways.
I mean, the emphasis that you choose is quite important because I know you said there are a lot of online climate teaching resources, but very few focus on carbon footprint and carbon literacy. Is that the gap you're trying to fill?
Yes, definitely. That's the exact gap. Obviously, we do aim to teach students about the basics of climate science so that they understand how and why this is happening and the consequences of it. But then we try to shift the focus on to, okay, what can we as individuals and families and communities do to help? Partly because it's an important part of the jigsaw of solving the problem. It's not the biggest part of the jigsaw, but it is part of the jigsaw, and also partly because it's fun and empowering. A lot of people want to do something, and giving them concrete, practical things that they can do. It gives a real sense of positive well-being.
So, in order to do that, you set up Climate Ed, didn't you? How did that happen?
Oh, it's one of those classic things where, it sort of just happened through a series of fortuitous conversations and encounters, which sort of, and that's how it evolved. I had this sort of embryo of an idea, and then I met someone in the pub and we sort of started chatting about it. And it all started very small and very organically. I just went into a few local schools, and it just built from there, because we were just figuring it out as we went along, as you have to do sometimes. It's difficult to sort of come up with a big idea and right at the outset.
Yeah, I mean, lots of things happen by accident or through serendipity, and the sort of conversations you have that inspire you, to follow a sort of passion that you suddenly discovered you've got. So, I mean, one of the things you do in climate ed is you get involved with volunteers. You involve volunteers to go into school, don't you, and help change the climate change agenda there. What do those volunteers do?
Um, do you mean, Francis? What do they do when they go into schools, or what do they do in their regular lives when they're not volunteering?
What they do when they go on in schools. We won't go into their private lives.
Okay, sure. Well, they go into schools to deliver the climate ed program, which consists of 5 1-hour workshops exploring different aspects of climate change and carbon literacy. Um, and I suppose that you could probably break it down. They've got three main roles, but the first is to impart the knowledge, using the teaching skills that we teach them. The second is to inspire the students to maybe go away and start to do some things differently to help with climate change. And I suppose the third is to share their personal knowledge, and experience and connection with climate change with the students, because most of our volunteers do jobs related to climate change or have some kind of personal engagement with the topic, and the kids love sort of hearing their personal stories and encountering someone who's really engaged with the issue.
And I mean, to be straight, you work with primary schools, don't you? And that, to some extent, has got to shape your approach, doesn't it?
Yes. Primary schools are wonderful to work with in many ways, but partly because the children at that age are just so enthusiastic and receptive to new information and ideas that they're the most responsive audience you could imagine. And they just they roll their sleeves up and get stuck into all the activities and the ideas so willingly. um, at the same time, you have to recognize that this is quite a young age group. You definitely don't want to go in and sort of with the message that this is your responsibility, and we're placing all of this on your shoulders, because they're too young for that. But we just aim to introduce them to the topic in a fun, kind of exciting way.
I mean, I can see you still have the passion of almost it being a new project because the excitement's in your face as you talk. So, I mean, how many schools do you have in your network? And then when you get your volunteers, how are they integrated, or what they do? How is that integrated into the curriculum?
We've worked with just over 100 primary schools so far across mainly South London, now starting in the north of London as well. In terms of how our material is integrated into the curriculum, well, it's this big issue that climate change isn't on the national curriculum. It isn't explicitly on the primary school, geography syllabus. It's sort of half mentioned. So in that sense, we're offering something that is genuinely new and not a statutory requirement for schools.
um, you didn't just sort of meet in pubs and decide what you want to do and write it on paper and go and do it, did you? You actually went to visit schools. You tried to find out what the gaps were, and you tried to find out the best way of filling that gap in the way it is taught. So there was a lot of hard work in preparation to set up your project, wasn't there?
Yes, it took quite a long time and a lot of trial and error and a lot of going down dead ends. But I was very lucky because I had a connection with a local primary school where a teacher basically gave me a group of students to work with every lunchtime for almost a whole academic year. So I just went in every Monday lunchtime, testing content, testing different activities, seeing what worked, what didn't work. And then from that, we were able to sort of distill it down to a good program of activities.
So how long did it take you before you actually started with your first school?
Well, it's difficult because COVID happened. I suppose there was one academic year of trial and error, and then we had the program in a ready shape, crucially for volunteers to be able to deliver. Because there's one thing designing a program that you yourself as a teacher can deliver, but half of the challenge was getting it in a format that you could hand it to a volunteer and say, look, here it is, over to you. So that was part of the challenge, definitely.
And how did you sell it to teachers to get them involved? Because obviously you say there's a gap, but you've got to get the schools and you've got to get particularly the teachers on board. How did you get them to feel a part of the ownership with you of the project?
Yes, it's a good question. Well, I think we would say to schools and teachers, look, this is a crucial issue. You might feel uncertain how to teach it because it's a relatively new issue. It's not on the curriculum. We've got this great program. It's been designed by qualified teachers. It's totally free because it's delivered by an enthusiastic volunteer who's an expert on the subject. And that was usually enough to get schools signed up.
So when you went to your very first school, was there both a feeling of excitement and apprehension at the same time?
Absolutely. And actually, the first time we delivered it using volunteers, plenty of things went wrong because we were teaching whole year groups, two classes joined together. So 60 students in a classroom, which retrospectively, was a recipe for disaster because it was just too many students at the time. So the poor volunteers who did so well, trying to teach these huge cohorts of children. Then the next time around, we said, right, we'll just do 30 kids at a time, and it was much more manageable for them. So, yeah.
And did you do what we all do, make mistakes and then learn from that and move on?
Absolutely, all the time, and we're still doing that now. I mean, I suppose the fascinating thing about this work is, we're still working out what works and what has impact and how you can relate this message to people, so that they feel inspired and engaged and want to actually live differently. I mean, it's really complicated, and lots of people are doing research about it to figure out how best to do it.
So we talked about how you sort of generated the idea, how you contacted schools, how you work with teachers, but we haven't talked about the volunteers yet. I mean, getting the teachers, you know where they are, but where do you get what volunteers? How do you find them, and where are they based?
Yes, well, this was fascinating. I mean, initially I was relying on my kind of social networks within South London and people I knew through my local transition town. But then obviously we had to reach wider than that. So there are websites where you can recruit volunteers like Reach Volunteering, and then gradually word spread. But that has been by far the most exciting aspect of all Climate Ed's work. Getting in these incredibly knowledgeable, passionate volunteers, and that they've just sort of turbocharged all our work, really.
So do you have a sort of assessment of those volunteers? Because there may be some people who volunteer who are going to be hopeless if they can't relate to kids, they don't know enough about climate change, or they have an opinion about climate change which might not fit in with, your mission. I mean, how do you make sure the volunteers are authentic, genuine, and they will do the job?
Yes, I mean it's a good question, Francis, isn't it? That is a key issue. I suppose you can't just take anyone because you need to maintain a high quality of service to schools. I suppose, without wanting to sound sort of prejudiced against anyone, I suppose, if we get prospective volunteers who are obviously very zealous and ideological and you sense that's what drives them, maybe you feel they're not the best person to relate this message to children, because it's really important when you deliver the material to deliver it in a kind of calm, balanced, even tempered way, because the kids respond positively to that. So I think people who are very good at just imparting the facts and giving the children the opportunity to make up their own minds for themselves, that's really important.
So you have to have volunteers who are both committed and open-minded, and those combinations aren't easy, are they?
No, it's a good way of putting it. Committed and open-minded. I suppose, yes, the key thing is, being committed to the students' learning. When you go in as a volunteer, when you go in and teach a group of kids, it's not about you and what you want the kids to know. It's about sort of giving them the opportunity to explore this topic for themselves and giving them the chance to make up their own minds on something. It's not so much about you, it really is about them.
But you don't let them go in empty-handed. You provide training for them, and that's quite extensive, isn't it? Do you want to tell us about that training?
Yes, it begins with just an informal chat on the phone, just to sort of find out a bit more about the volunteer and their motivation. Then we give volunteers a chance to observe the session because it's one thing talking about it, but it really helps them to go and see how it works on the ground. Then once they sign up to do it, I give volunteers coaching sessions over Zoom just to get them familiar with the material and to get them familiar with some basic teaching techniques. And then they go in and start delivering. And then, there's ongoing support if they need it.
And is that something frightening for them as well? I mean, some of them may have done it before, but some of them, it might be the first time they even talk to a group. So, do they go in with a degree of apprehension as well?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think all volunteers do. If you're teaching for the first time, you just, it's difficult to know how a class of children will respond, but they always find it gets easier. And, they always come out glowing afterwards and say, oh, that was brilliant. I love that. It was such fun.
So practice reinforces their commitment and their confidence. You mentioned you have two aims. One is to teach climate science. Now, how do you do that to primary school children?
Well, we do rely on some really excellent teaching videos, which have been made by a non-profit in America, and they're a great resource that we use. But we also try to build a bit from the students' own knowledge because it's funny when you visit a primary school, there are always a few students who are quite knowledgeable about the topic. So it's always nice to kind of elicit their knowledge and use that as a foundation to learn from as well.
And you also say, don't you, that you try to encourage young people to take action on issues with their local community. Can you give us some examples of how they've done that?
Yes, well, look, I suppose there are obvious ones like looking at how you travel around and travel to school and, using lower carbon forms of transport where possible. Um, we encourage students to look at where their food comes from, and avoid air freighted long distance food and try to get food from local producers. And I suppose also just thinking about the question of how you can maybe live a smaller life, see what sort of things are happening on your local doorstep, which don't require you to travel, long distances and use loads of energy. So just sort of shaping their frames of reference in that way.
In a way, though, that's with the families, isn't it, themselves? I mean, do you encourage the kids to talk to people in their community as well? And how do you do that? Because with primary school children, young people, it must be very difficult to do that.
Yes, well, when we started out, we did occasionally go out with little sort of street education teams from the primary schools we work with and go out into local areas to teach the public about climate change, which was brilliant. And the kids absolutely loved it, and the public loved it. They just thought it was fascinating. We can't do so much of that anymore just because the sort of like health and safety stuff and risk assessments, it gets a bit complicated. But we do encourage the students to share the message with their families and communities and friends where they can.
I mean, did you find out about health and safety issues on the trot, really? It's something, you start something and then you suddenly realize you've got to do a lot of other things you didn't even think of. Was that one of them?
Well, partly, I mean, I was with, the burden of that fell on the teachers and the schools we were working with, and then, for them, they had to send all these letters home. Do you give your child permission to do this? And so we just thought, okay, this is unworkable going forward because it's too much work for the teachers.
Yeah, I know that is difficult, but it has to be done. I mean,
Yeah.
you said on your site, you said if families are inspired to drop just 1 ton from their annual carbon footprint, that's over 1,000 tons of CO2 saved and stops it saved from going into the atmosphere. Now, is that an aspiration of yours, or is that something you can measure?
It's definitely an aspiration. Is it something we can measure? We'd love to measure it. I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, we were looking at this and just on, if you focus on the issue of how children get to school and say, we had students who were saying, look, I've stopped driving to school and now I'm walking. That's great. But then if you try to measure the amount of CO2 saved, it gets incredibly complicated because to measure it accurately, you'd have to know what kind of car that student was driving, the distance they'd normally travel, how many people usually travel in the car, and then crunch all those numbers. It gets very tricky. And as I heard a scientist say recently, if you multiply funny numbers by funny numbers, you get hilarious numbers. So it's quite easy to get your numbers going a bit skew.
But you do have some evidence, don't you? I mean, they may be indications rather than measurements. For example, I think on your site you say 54% of students were making fewer journeys by car, and 32% of students reported at least one family member eating less meat. So that's a sign of success in a way, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. That the data so far has been really encouraging, and we want to do more impact assessment like that because that's critical. I mean, I think we've got to be realistic here. We do need to think really rigorously about how much impact we're having and is it working. If it's not working as much as we'd like it to, how can we tweak the message or do things differently?
Okay, so I mean, you're working with primary school children. And one of the things that's interesting, I mean, their future is going to be affected more than, say, mine, because they've got years and years ahead of them and they're going to face the consequences of climate change. Do you find that when you talk to them, there is enthusiasm to do something about it, or that what's been created is anxiety?
Well, we definitely, obviously, avoid creating anxiety. I mean, it's really important to avoid that. And so, the whole message of the program is about, positive, practical things we can do, which are hopefully fun as well. And and yes, as I said before, the children of this age are very enthusiastic and want to do the right thing. And in a way, they sort of look at the world in quite black and white binary terms, like, okay, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do, in a way that adults maybe sort of obfuscate and complicate things a bit more. So in that sense, there's a huge amount of energy and that can be harnessed. Yes.
And do you find as a result of what you do, those young people then go home and educate their parents?
Yes, we do. We often get sort of anecdotal evidence from children that they go off and have interesting conversations with their parents who sometimes are sort of less receptive to the message or more skeptical or more sort of have ingrained habits that they're reluctant to change, quite understandably. But they do, that's another whole part of the program that the students love sort of sharing their knowledge and being mini experts on the topic and in that way.
So in a way, I mean, what you do is important, isn't it? Because you're actually thinking of future generations. We have a habit in our society today to think short term. Since the Industrial Revolution, it's all short term. Getting children involved this way does look at long-term thinking. And in a way, you're helping to do that as well, aren't you?
Yes, I suppose there might be sort of psychologists who say that human beings are just not, as a species, very good at long-term thinking. I'm not an expert on this, but there are people who say that human beings are good at responding to immediate, visible, clear threats, and they're not so good, evolutionarily, at looking at long distance, invisible threats, which is what climate change is. But we're trying to address that in the best way we can.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book recently been written called The Good Ancestor, which actually deals with that. Are we hardwired for short-term thinking, or is that a cultural thing that's developed since the time of the Enlightenment? And that's an interesting debate we could have some other time. But in terms of what you do, I mean, how would you like to see you in climate ed develop in the coming years?
Well, we would definitely like to expand our geographical area of operation. We'd like to sort of spread borough by borough in London and elsewhere in the UK, possibly internationally, simply because I'm not aware of many schemes which are harnessing the power of volunteers in this way. Having said that, though, I think you've got to recognise that the audience you can reach with volunteers is inherently limited, and to have the biggest impact, you need to get teachers on board. Because they're the ones with the captive audience every day in schools. So we do need to look at the way we can create resources for teachers to deliver on this topic as well.
And are you geared up as an organisation to expand in that way, or would you need more help?
I would definitely need more help. We're, in all sorts of ways, Climate Ed is a tiny, tiny charity at the moment. But, obviously we need, more funding. Yeah, that's the main one, funding. But what we do have is a very good operating model that's refined and is getting more refined. And we're experimenting with nice things like volunteers training other volunteers, which immediately unlocks potential to expand it much more. So it is definitely scalable.
I mean, some people argue, having a discussion about this over the weekend, that, volunteers take work away from paid people. But volunteers are important, aren't they? Because we couldn't deliver in a whole series of things from teaching to climate to care, for example, without volunteers being involved.
Yeah, it's interesting, Frans. I've never thought about it that way. I mean, what we're doing just relies totally on volunteers, and I don't, as I see it, we're not taking work away from anyone, but it's really about people having the opportunity to share their knowledge, pass it on to the next generation, build community links. And people do love doing things as volunteers. I think it makes it even more special for them and meaningful that they're not paid, they're doing it out of love and passion.
Yeah, I mean, that collaborative form of working, that community networking can really only be done, I think, effectively by volunteers. Full-time people are important, but the volunteers will have, as you say, the commitment and the passion. I mean, we sort of come to the end of the 30 minutes now. So can I ask you, if anybody wanted to find out more about what you do and make contact, where would they go?
Go to our website, www.climateed.net.
And would they would have an email there as well, would they?
There's a contact form where you can drop us a line, and we'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing the interview. I mean, I think the work you're doing is really fantastic, and it does help teachers who are under pressure anyhow, and to have people come in and help in that way, I think is added value for the young people in the schools. And I hope we can help out as well in for Climate Action Forum with the work you're doing, because I hope we'll have volunteers who would be interested in being involved. So thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you for telling us what you're doing is and how you hope to develop the service that you've got. So thanks, Ben. It's been a great interview, and we'll end this interview now.